run. It doesn't really make any difference what we.
I was amazed, John, with running a business and taking care of 4 kids.
Who, us?
Yeah, and you got the package from, the stuff from us,
You
and
make
you
up lady.
immediately started going
Take
through
those
it.
3 years
I
where
mean,
they should
I
be.
couldn't believe it. I said to Larry, he must have just, I mean, it was right before Christmas. I
No.
said, he must have just dropped everything, and because, I mean, you didn't just look at it, you perused everything.
I had to go through
Yeah.
it. I had to go through it and get it organized into larger groups, you know, to then store it and put it in places and so forth. So just to.
Well, John, it's a long story.
Yeah, it's a long story.
There must be some phase of it you're more interested in than
Well, I don't know. Let's start from the beginning. Why does it start in 1880?
H.C.'s father was a miller by trade, and in 1880 he was still a miller, but he was making them on the side for his friends, and that's why they chose the oldest possible date.
When did he have?
But then he lost his mill in the Panic of '93.
But he only built that mill in around 87 or so. I mean, that was a real fresh.
He was buying it on time from Horace Barron, the one at Rice Creek.
Okay, all right.
And the farmers couldn't make their payments, so he couldn't make his payments.
Right.
So he lost the mill, and this was in the Panic of '93.
Grandpa said they had chickens in the yard. That's how poor they were.
Yeah, well, it depends what time you're talking about.
Right after that, 93.
Yeah, but if you look at the Little Lord Fauntleroy, Grandpa was born in '85. When he was 5 or 6 years old, he's dressed in velvet, and they had a sort of a middle-class existence with money to go to the photographer and so forth. And then they went off a slippery slope when he's 7 or 8 years old. And that was the year he says he got 1 orange for Christmas. And this had gathered his mind rather well, I think. I don't know.
It would.
But it was after the Panic of '93. His father tried a feeded grain store where Gil Sherman's office was on Main Street. You've seen a picture.
That's the picture. That's the picture of it.
Yeah,
Sure.
it didn't last at all, but there is evidence of it. You see it in the city directories, and you see it in the advertisements in the old newspapers and stuff, but it died out very fast. And he started taking the streetcar over to Battle Creek and looking for ruptured individuals, stopping strangers. And Grandpa said he had a 6th sense, and he could tell by the way a man walked if he had a hernia. And he'd go up to the stranger and say, "Excuse me, sir, but I think I have something to help you," and take him in a tavern, and on a good day he'd come home with a couple $3 gold pieces, sell a couple of appliances, and then he'd leave his card and the guy could order another one when it wore out, you know. But Charles E. Brooks was an ordained Methodist minister, and he was a circuit rider in the, I guess, I don't know what they call it, but he would take the stint of ministers in this vicinity who were on vacation, and he would go one Sunday to Lion Lake Methodist Church and one Sunday to Olivet Methodist Church, and so he widened his circle of acquaintance that way, and everywhere he went like that, he was also known as the hernia man, and all these farmers, a lot of them had hernias, and they would wait for Charlie Brooks to come up, and that's how he started to pick up a clientele. By 1895, I believe it was, or 96, there's that handbill in existence that advertises their upstairs over drugstore.
What was Peck's and Carrington's?
Yeah. It's now a travel agency, Williams Travel Agency. And the entrance was a door on the right-hand side of there's a stairway up, it's still there.
Okay.
And Stub Welsh used to collect the rent. Grandpa Stub Welsh, worked for Brooks Appliance for about 50 years, and later on. And he said he used to come to the top of the stairs and spread his feet and bellow, "Rent!" And then he would find it somewhere, and that was it for another week or another month. But things went along there for some time, selling a few appliances every week and making a reasonable living, and until H.C. joined his father in 1903.
But when those letters, when Grandpa ran away from home in 1901, CE wrote to him out there and said he had an enormous number. They'd already started doing some mail order work. They had, because he said he couldn't keep up with the letters. Jager, can't think of the first.
Perry.
Was it Perry Jager?
Perry was the older brother that, you know, Grandpa adored him. He died at the age of 20 years.
No, and it was, I don't think it was Perry, it was so, well, I don't know, it was somebody, well, maybe it was Perry, who was working there, but had just gotten married and was gonna leave, and Grandpa needed somebody to help.
I think it would have been Perry because, you know, Bernadine was born about 1900, 1901, or,
Okay,
and she was born after her father died.
okay.
And
When did Grandpa work for, what was his real name? Crystal?
Andrew Crystal,
Oh, okay, all
I
right.
think that was his name.
Okay.
It might have been
Well,
alias.
it looks so,
It
it looked like an alias.
It was like the Duke and the Huckleberry Finn or something, I don't know.
Has Johnny heard the story about opening the mail when,
Johnny told me the story about the hoe.
oh,
Yeah.
That's what, I remember Grandpa saying that, the gal sat there at the end of the table and the girls would put the money in and she'd hoe it into a basket. And that was real,
Helen Hemmingson.
it was real impressive.
Well, Grandpa used to say things that were rather avaricious once in a while. He would say, for instance, that the most beautiful sound in the world was the sound of a cash register ringing. He liked that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I don't know, you know, exactly what the chronology is, whether Perry worked for him. I know his wife did the sewing. Ellen Brooks did the sewing for the hernia belts for the first few years, from say 1880 to 1902 or something. And I know that the people who wore them sent other people, and it was better than anything on the market. And Grandpa said he made the first one for himself, and that his father had severe hernias from setting millstones. He said he was highly skilled in the art of stone dressing, which is the placement of the round, heavy stones so that the tolerance to grind the grain is just perfect, and it took some physical strength, and it was quite a rupture maker. It was an occupational hazard. A lot of millers had hernias because of lifting the millstones.
Sure.
So, of course, for most of his life, Charles Brooks was working for other people. He was a foreman and a manager of a mill and so forth for someone else, and was only that last one that he was actually buying his own, where it all blew up on him. And he was pretty old by then. You realize he died in 1913 at the age of
He was
what?
born in what, 45?
66 or 7, huh?
He was born in
46, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I have a letter, and he was talking about his father and his father's views on slavery and why his father wasn't in the Civil War and so forth, and that's kind of interesting.
I remember you told me something about that before.
But I don't know if you want to get into that, but
When was, so Grandpa came on in 1903?
yes,
So when did Grandpa work for Andrew Crystal?
6 months before he went to work for his father.
Okay,
What was the year he went to Iowa?
1901,
Okay.
from the
Well, that's
end of July to the
That's it.
middle of September.
Well, Professor Crystal put advertisements in newspapers all over the country, I guess. And he had a system of mail order follow-up when he got the inquiry. They'd send him the order blanks and the propaganda testimonials, and when they didn't buy, they'd write him another letter. We can't understand why we haven't heard from you, sir. You know, I think you have something
The
we need."
E2, yeah.
And all this, and these were all done by hand, by these kids with pen and ink, probably dipping pens and inkwells.
What was the name of the position that Grandpa had? I didn't even write it
Well,
down.
he referred to himself as an amanuensis. Professor Crystal probably referred to him as an amanuensis. It just meant some kid that's sitting there and really copied all day.
Okay, all right.
But they had a lot of fun. I guess there were a lot of
Why
other
would he
kids.
hire him if he didn't have a high school diploma?
He had lovely handwriting, I would think.
Oh,
Yes, he did. He had very clear, good handwriting. I think that's probably what got him the job. Well, all the kids did then. They really emphasized it in school. So, where do we go from here? Now, you want the rest of the Brooks Appliance story. It didn't take long at all after Grandpa joined his father and started to put some of the Andrew Crystal adornments on the business that started to grow exponentially.
You said that he went to who did he buy the house from? The guy that owned the bank, First National Bank.
Oh, that was about 1920.
Well, I was 20, but who's
Dibble.
No, not Dibble. Who owned the house?
Oh, Gorham.
Gorham.
Yeah.
Didn't he go to Gorham and want to borrow 10 grand?
No, I think it was Charles Page. It was a Page. It was that's a good story. Yes, Charlie Brooks, just before Grandpa was on the scene, offered one of the Page brothers a half interest in the hernia business. He wanted some seed money or something for $500, and the guy didn't take it and regretted it ever after. The Page brother, who was, you know, some relative of Bill Page or Nixie Page, or
Yeah.
somebody we know, and I think it was Nixie's father, as a matter of fact. And, yeah, it was an interesting story. Well, of course, Charlie Brooks' brother, Richard, who had the boarders, and his wife had the boarding house where Doc Humphrey was on the corner there across from the library.
My grandfather Twist lived there for a while.
Did he? Anyway, he had a chance to be partner with F.W. Woolworth back in Ithaca, and his miserable wife never let him forget it just about every day of his life. If he'd have done that deal with Frank Woolworth, that's the way it goes. Richard, Grandpa said, was absolutely good for nothing, his Uncle Richard. And he put him on the payroll down at the office.
Which is the one who smoked?
Yes, Richard had these
Oh.
foul-smelling cheroot cigars, or whatever they were.
They had a hard time stopping that. I read some inter-company correspondence about no more smoking, and
Oh, yeah.
nobody could really come up to Uncle Richard and
Yeah.
tell him he couldn't smoke.
Yeah.
Grandpa could write the internal communique, but I don't.
Well, you know, the office politics involved a lot of family matters. There was a terrible brouhaha about Uncle Pete not getting any pension after working there for 50 years, and well, we can't start that now. And Grandpa's, of course, delegated to Bud the duty of telling George that he couldn't have anything, and Carrie Bell was mad as a hornet. So I don't know. I've heard about these things.
Sure.
And the criticism that Grandpa absorbed, he used to tell it about how his mother would inveigh with him about, I hear you hired another Catholic down there, Harold. How can you hire so many Catholics? And she hated Catholics, apparently. And he told it years later as if they weren't perfectly good workers, and all their other Catholic friends were there. Why shouldn't he hire some more Catholics? You know, and laughing at his mother's prejudice. And of course, he also talked about the Civic Center. She put up most of the money for the church down there, the Methodist Church. And later on, it became the Civic Center, and the city rented it to the Jaycees, and they had bingo games in the basement and dancing. And he says, my mother never knew that they had gambling and dancing in that building. She never would have done it. Never would have put up the money. My mother said that her grandmother Brooks was a lugubrious woman who was always afraid she was dying the next day, and she'd go in to see her, and she'd have a damp handkerchief over her eyes, lying on the couch, and she says it was sadness and gloom, and that in my mother's estimation, that's where H.C. got his lugubrious streak, which he did have one. He would every once in a while get on these morbid kicks about, well, I may not be around, and then he'd write these great long letters about when I may not be around next year, and this was 40 years before he died, you know.
Yeah.
And
That house was always dark. I remember going to visit
And Emma,
Aunt Emma, and it
Yeah.
was the.
same thing.
was
She had the
Zalfa,
lugubrious streak too.
And Zalfa was,
Mhm.
although Aunt Emma was from the Carrolls, but it was, it was the house that did it.
I don't know, but
Well,
Aunt Emma had bad eyesight and needed
Lillian
it.
Seymour
She had that eye
lives there
shade.
now, yeah.
Well, there isn't a scratch on that house. Nobody ever had a child in that house in 70 years. George Siemens, the closest ever came, and he was fully grown before Emma ever died. So, anyway,
Good point.
whoever gets that house has got a winner, I'll tell you.
So when
George
did,
and his wife are gonna live there, I'm sure.
Well, fine.
but his kids are all grown, aren't they? George and his gal?
Does he, I don't think he has any kids, maybe she did.
She's got a couple,
Seaman, you
Oh.
mean.
yeah.
I don't know, but, CE and Vetter never lived in that house, or if he did, it was just a week or something before he died, because they lived on High Street or on Michigan Avenue, and they built that house,
Okay,
and he didn't live to enjoy it. But his widow went in there with her spinster daughter and so on. Maybe two spinster daughters, I don't know, when Nettie was married.
Nettie and Emma were half-sisters.
Yeah.
They-
No, Nettie and Emma were full sisters. They were Grandpa's half-sisters. And Nettie, Lily, Nettie, and Emma
Were all
were
Carrolls.
full sisters.
Yes,
And then Harry was the second wife, and Lou and Harold was the third wife.
right.
So the three older women were
When did Lou come into the business? 1903?
not until it was going great guns. He had a good job at the Page Brothers Buggy Company, but when the automobile came in 1908, 9, 10, whenever the buggy business died, they were laying them off in droves at the Page Brothers Buggy Company, and Brooks Appliance was going up at the same time, and Lou was working in the upholstery shops at the Page Brothers Buggy Company, and they got a lot of people making cushions and stuff that came out of the Page Brothers Buggy Company
Okay.
at that time, and
Because of these letters.
because he was a member of the family, they started out with the idea that Harold would do the office work and Lou would run the factory and be in charge of the manufacturing because he's good with his hands and he's been doing this
Yeah,
over
sure.
there. And Pop would just superintend everything. And it didn't work out from the beginning. Lou was 5 years older than Harold and jealous of Harold's relatively privileged position in the firm with some justice. You know, these things are not usually black and white. And I think what alienated Harold and Lou, although they reconciled often too, they had these horrible fights and wouldn't talk to each other for 3 months, usually occurring while they were both drunk. And then they'd get back together and everything would go along fine for a year or so, and then they'd have another one. And but I think that the trouble was that, I think it is true that Harold was a lot more responsible than Lou. And the parents seemed to realize it, and they always sided with Harold when there was a difference of opinion. And Lou, being 5 years older, got quite provoked with this. And so, now this, of course, leads to the story of the ownership of the place and how it progressed. And you know it probably, but I can tell you if you want.
Well, yeah, please do.
All right, it was a sole proprietorship
CE.
until the day CE died in 1913. And this means that all the time they were over there in London in 1910, starting the London business and all that, it was all a proprietorship owned by CE Brooks. Now, Grandpa had tested a few magazines in England, and they did wonderfully well, but there was a great lag when the goods were being sent on trial or something. The packaged mail wasn't very fast, and if they needed an exchange and so on, had to go through customs a few times. This is going to work a lot better if we have a place over there to give better service. And so he went over there, and he was right, it did work a lot better. But he said he had to fight his father every inch of the way. For every $10, for every $100, for every $1,000 that he wanted to put back into the business, his father would say, "Harold, I have seen hard times. you don't know how well we're doing right now, young man, and we don't want to throw all this away on any gamble. You know, what if this ad doesn't work? What if that office doesn't work out the way you think it will, and so on. He says it was really just terribly hard. It's just dragging every incremental improvement out of him. He doesn't talk about it like that very often because, of course, it didn't last very long, and the old man was dead, and then Harold did whatever he wanted. And of course, when the old man died, he left it in a three-way partnership between Harold, Lou, and his widow. And I don't know if he had an understanding with his widow or whether she just took it out upon herself, but out of her 1/3 share, she took care of the older sisters, the half-sisters, the stepchildren that she...
Bernadine, Nettie, Emma,
And Lily,
Lily.
yeah.
Okay.
And
Is
so...
that when they split the company between the international part and the Marshall part? I mean, there's always...
I'm not sure about
The
that.
stock shares, they,
It was always a different...
oh, is it a different company?
I think it probably, the big change came when Mrs. Grandma Brooks died,
It was in 34?
32, I think.
Okay.
And at that point, there were terms of CE Inventor's will that were triggered. And he said at that point, the business shall be diced into twelfths, and 4/12 will be Harold's, and 4/12 will be Lou's, and the other 4/12 will go exactly 1/6. I mean, I think Nettie got
No,
one.
that's correct, your math is right.
Nettie got 1/6, Bernadine got 1/6, Emma got 1/6, and Lily got 1/6. That's 4/6, which is...
2/3.
No.
Right.
That isn't right.
Maybe it's 12ths.
Yeah, they each got 1/12,
Okay.
which would be 4/12, which would be 1/3.
Okay.
And the other thirds were Harold and Lou.
Okay.
So as far as the profit sharing is concerned, that's the way it went for a long, long time after she died in 1932. And then as far as salaries were concerned, Harold and Lou always got the same, even though it swiftly developed that Lou would never be there and Harold would do everything. That was agreeable to both of them.
Well,
So, and that's how the ownership evolved. And then, of course, Aunt Lily was in Benton Harbor, and that devolved into Ganung's.
right.
She married Ganung. Aunt Lily was Mrs. Ganung, and that devolved into Haney, Shirley Haney, and
Sure.
Menser, Doris
Francis.
Menser, and Francis Ganung.
Yeah.
And the Bernadine shares did devolve to Shirley Haney, her daughter,
Right.
and Scott Wrights. And the Emma shares were left when Aunt Emma died,
To Bud.
partly to Bud and partly back to Harold.
Okay.
Mostly back to Harold, but something back to Bud. And that's why Bud always had a larger interest than Carolyn or Emmy,
Okay.
because Emma favored him. He was a good little church boy. I
Okay.
think it had something to do with that. She was a good church woman.
Right.
And so for those halcyon years of 1915, 16, 18, 21, 22, 23, it was strictly a three-way split, Harold, Lou, and their mother. And she was taking upon herself to send money to the girls who needed it. I don't think maybe Will Simons did pretty well. He had a furnace company and so on. Maybe he didn't need the money, maybe Bernadine did. She married the railroad engineer, Charlie Richards. But they all had little extras from
Sure.
Mrs. Brooks because she
Sure.
didn't know what else to do with it. She was
Sure.
loaded.
I think they made more money in the teens than they did any other time, in relative terms.
Oh, I think so. Oh,
Just-
no, in the early 20s were terrific. The 20s before the crash.
Okay. We just,
Bernadine, well, I saw one workout, and I'll give it to you, I've got it somewhere, which indicated that in 1926, I know he got 3,000 inquiries in one day, It's a lot of increase. You're selling 40% of them. And he spent $23, he spent $21 in advertising for every $23 in gross first order sales. And of course, all the profit business was in the reorders. But even at that 21 to 23, it was practically breaking even on the first orders. So he just put the thing, that was a little too much. He put the thing to the floor, you can see. He just said, well, we'll just take every backwoods newspaper in Canada, every screwy magazine we can find, and
Yeah,
the
advertising.
more the merrier.
Now, who did the advertising?
Oh, all the top guys in America. He knew them. We named some. J. Walter Thompson, he knew J. Walter Thompson. He was wined and dined by those people. Those old early, Lasky, or what was his name? Grandpa was spending a hell of a lot of money on it.